Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So, imagine discovering that the very things you spend your entire life trying to control, right? Like your wealth, your reputation, your family.
Yeah, or even just the thoughts in your own head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine finding out those are the exact things causing your deepest, most chronic misery. Today, we're opening up a 2,500-year-old psychological mirror to look at that exact problem.
It's a tough mirror to look into, honestly.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack chapters 5 through 8 of the Dhammapada. And our goal here is to act as your guides, helping you extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the actual life application from this ancient text.
And the structure of this text is really what makes it so enduring. We aren't just looking at, a random assortment of ancient proverbs here.
Right, it's not just fortune cookie advice.
Exactly. There's a very deliberate architectural progression in the 4 chapters we're unpacking today. The text starts by diagnosing this deep human sickness, which it calls the delusions of the fool in chapter 5.
The fool.
Ouch. Yeah, it doesn't pull punches. But from that diagnosis, we move into the cure, which is the deliberate self-craftsmanship of the wise man in chapter 6. And then we see the ultimate result of that craftsmanship, which is the total liberation of the venerable in chapter 7.
And then it all wraps up with chapter 8, right?
Right. Chapter 8 is called The Thousands, and it presents this radical reevaluation of how we measure time, value, and just the quality of our existence.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly understand what wisdom is, I think we first have to understand what it isn't. And like you said, the text doesn't hold back. Chapter 5 begins with this harsh, uncompromising diagnosis of the fool.
It's a very striking label.
It is. I mean, in our modern vocabulary, if you call someone a fool, you're usually taking a shot at their intelligence, right? Like their IQ or their common sense. But reading this ancient framing, the definition is it's completely different.
Oh, entirely. It's completely disconnected from intellectual capacity. In this tradition, you could have a genius-level IQ, hold 3 PhDs, run a massive corporation, and still be the absolute embodiment of the fool.
Wow. So how do they define it then?
Well, the text defines foolishness not as a cognitive deficit, but as a severe lack of self-awareness. And it's coupled with this really heavy reliance on toxic attachments. It's basically a state of spiritual and emotional blindness.
So they're just operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of reality.
Exactly. You see that fundamental misunderstanding right away in verse 62. The text says the fool is tormented by thoughts like, these sons belong to me and this wealth belongs to me.
Which sounds pretty normal by today's standards, honestly.
It does. But the text notes this profound, almost tragic irony. It says the fool doesn't even belong to himself, let alone his wealth or his family.
Man, that isolates the core illusion right there, the illusion of ownership and control. We spend our whole lives accumulating resources, people, titles, capital, and we fiercely defend them because we draw this mental boundary around them and say, mine.
Right, this is mine, I own this. But the text is forcing a confrontation with reality. Do you really possess them? Your wealth can be erased by a systemic economic shock on a random Tuesday afternoon.
Aren't you?
Gone.
Exactly. And your children, they're autonomous beings with their own trajectories, their own desires, their flaws. They are not your property.
Right. They aren't just extensions of your ego. And when a parent views a child as their property, you see this intense enmeshment.
Oh, absolutely.
The parent is agonizing over every single decision the child makes because the child's failure feels like a reduction of the parent's own worth. So the parent is tormented by the illusion of control, and the child is just suffocated by it. And the ultimate checkmate the text delivers is that, hey, you don't even own yourself.
Wait, what do you mean, biologically?
Biologically and psychologically. Right. Biologically, you don't control the division of your cells. You don't consciously regulate your endocrine system. You certainly don't control the aging process, right?
Fortunately, no. I definitely do not.
Right. And psychologically, you don't even control the random intrusive thoughts that pop into your consciousness. So the fool is tormented because they're trying to hold a handful of water with a death grip.
Oh, that's a great image.
Yeah. And the tighter they squeeze, the faster the water escapes through their fingers and the more panicked they become.
It's just a recipe for chronic anxiety. Which actually brings us to this amazing paradox in verse 63. It essentially states that the only wise fool is the one who actually knows they're a fool.
Yes. A fool who thinks they're wise is the ultimate fool.
We actually see this quantified in modern psychology now. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh, right, where people overestimate their skills.
Exactly. People with low ability at a task totally overestimate their ability precisely because they lack the meta-awareness to recognize their own incompetence.
It really echoes the Socratic paradox, I know that I know nothing. The most dangerous state of human existence is walking around completely oblivious to your own blind spots, your cognitive biases, and just your general lack of control over the universe while being absolutely certain that you have it all figured out.
Right. But the moment you pause and admit, like, wow, I really know very little and my control is so fragile, that's when a crack of light gets in.
Admitting ignorance is the prerequisite for learning. You just can't fill a cup that believes it's already full.
Which leads right into verse 64. The text gives us this incredible visual for closed-mindedness. It says that if a soul is associated with a wise man, even for their whole life, they will perceive the truth as little as a spoon perceives the taste of soup.
The spoon metaphor. I love this one.
It's so good. Think about the mechanics of a spoon. It's submerged in the broth. It's surrounded by the heat, the nutrients, the complex flavors. But because it's made of impermeable metal, it takes absolutely nothing in.
The soup just slides right off.
Exactly. And I see a massive modern equivalent to this in how we consume information today.
Oh, we are swimming in an ocean of unprecedented access to wisdom right now.
We really are. I mean, we doom scroll self-help content. We listen to hours of philosophy podcasts, neurobiology lectures, habit-building seminars. We curate these incredible social feeds of successful, driven people.
We are sitting in the broth.
We are sitting in the broth. But we mistake our proximity to the information for the actual possession of wisdom. You can save 100 inspirational quotes to your camera roll, but if you never change your underlying behavior, if you don't do the painful work of rewriting your habits, you're just a metal spoon.
Yeah, the contrast to that is provided right after in verse 65. It states that an intelligent, receptive person associated with a wise person for even 1 minute will perceive the truth as the tongue perceives the taste of soup.
The tongue, not the spoon.
Right,
Oh.
because the tongue is porous, it has receptors, it actively engages with the chemical composition of the food, and that food physically alters the body. The tongue allows itself to be changed by the experience.
That raises such a crucial question for anyone listening to this deep dive right now. When you consume a piece of content or read a book or even just receive feedback from your partner, are you acting as a spoon or a tongue?
That's the real test.
Are you letting the information actually penetrate your defenses and change your chemistry? Or are you letting it just wash over your impermeable exterior so you can feel productive without actually having to change?
And, the text highlights just how ancient this problem of performative learning really is. In verses 70 and 73, the author calls out fools who eat their food like ascetics with the tip of a blade of kusa grass, or who desire precedence among the monks, wanting the highest seat in the convent.
Okay, eating with a blade of grass sounds like an incredibly tedious way to get calories.
It was an extreme form of fasting practiced in ancient India, so the cultural context is pretty important here. During this period, extreme asceticism, like really punishing the body to liberate the soul, was viewed as the absolute height of spiritual achievement.
Well.
But the author is looking at these practitioners and just calling it out as hollow performance. They're addressing a culture where people were engaging in these outward, visible rituals of extreme holiness while secretly harboring immense inward pride.
So they were doing it for the clout.
Exactly. They wanted to suffer publicly so that society would grant them VIP status, that highest seat in the religious community.
Human nature really hasn't changed a bit, has it? We just swapped out blades of kusa grass for humble bragging on LinkedIn about working 90-hour weeks. Or posting those highly curated photos of our 5 a.m. cold plunges.
Yes, the 5 a.m. cold plunge post. It is pure virtue signaling. The goal isn't actual internal discipline. The goal is the false reputation. We want the social currency of appearing wise without doing the quiet, unglamorous internal work.
Which brings up a significant obstacle for modern readers, I think, when encountering this text. As modern people living in highly egalitarian, inclusive societies, we naturally resist the harsh, judgmental framing of a chapter entirely dedicated to calling people fools.
It feels exclusionary. We definitely prefer softer language today.
Right, like if I went into the office and started categorizing my colleagues as fools because they were overly attached to their job titles, HR would fire me by lunchtime.
Oh, without a doubt.
We prefer phrases like, they're on their own journey, or they're operating from a place of trauma. We cushion the blow to protect the ego.
We do, but this ancient text operates like a surgeon's scalpel. It doesn't care about protecting the ego, it cares about removing the tumor. Ignoring our inner foolishness or, cushioning it with therapy speak isn't harmless. Verse 71 gives this chilling warning.
What does it say?
It says, an evil deed doesn't turn suddenly like newly drawn milk souring. Instead, it smolders like fire covered by ashes following the fool.
Wow, smoldering like fire under ashes. That implies something hidden but incredibly destructive.
Yeah, the mechanism here is all about delayed consequences. Think about it. When milk goes bad, you know immediately. It smells, it curdles, you throw it out. But when you act out of ego, when you subtly undermine a coworker, when you prioritize performative validation over authentic connection, the consequences rarely show up that afternoon.
The sky doesn't fall.
Right. In fact, verse 69 points out that the fool often thinks their bad deeds are sweet like honey at first. You might actually get the promotion. You might get the dopamine hit of the social media likes.
So you get positive reinforcement for toxic behavior.
Exactly, but the text is warning us that the physics of reality don't care about your short-term wins. You've just buried hot coals under a layer of ash. The longer you walk on those ashes, thinking everything is fine, the more the heat builds until you eventually burn your house down. Living out of alignment with reality guarantees suffering. The only variable is the timeline.
So if you're listening to this, look at your life this week. In what specific area are you acting like a spoon, avoiding the heat of those hidden coals? Maybe it's a financial habit you read books about but never actually fix. Or maybe it's a recurring argument where you prioritize being right over understanding your partner. Where are you surrounded by the right answers but completely failing to internalize them? Try to identify just one area and actively choose to become the tongue. Take the uncomfortable feedback. Actually implement the advice.
And, that transition from being a passive spoon to an active tongue is the exact pivot the text makes as we move out of the diagnosis of Chapter 5 and into the treatment plan of Chapter 6.
Okay, so if the fool is blindly swept away by the illusion of ownership, outward of appearances, and the smoldering ash of bad decisions, how do we step out of that darkness? How do we actually manufacture wisdom?
Chapter 6 answers this, and the language shifts dramatically from passive ignorance to intense, active construction. The imagery in verse 80 is some of the most enduring in the entire text. It says, well makers lead the water, fletchers bend the arrow, carpenters bend a log of wood, wise people fashion themselves.
It's a total rejection of the idea that wisdom is just a fixed trait.
It really is a radical statement of human agency. Wisdom is not a magical download from the universe. It isn't a genetic disposition you're born with. It's a grueling craft. Look at the mechanics of a fletcher making an arrow. You don't just walk into a forest and find a perfectly aerodynamic straight stick lying on the ground.
Right. You find a raw, bent, flawed piece of wood.
Exactly. The fletcher has to apply steam, heat, and immense physical pressure to force that wood out of its natural crooked state until it can fly true.
And a carpenter doesn't just stare at a log and manifest a chair. They use saws to cut away what isn't needed. They use sandpaper to smooth the rough edges. There's friction involved. The text is telling us that our minds, our default emotional reactions, our character, these are just raw materials. If you want to be wise, you cannot leave yourself in your default state. You have to pick up the tools and do the violent work of fashioning yourself.
And the modern neurological equivalent of this is neuroplasticity. We now know that the brain literally wires itself based on repeated thoughts and behaviors. The bent wood is your default neural pathways, like the habit of snapping in anger when criticized or reaching for your phone the second you feel bored.
Right.
Fashioning yourself means applying the heat and pressure of conscious awareness to build new pathways. It requires repetition and a lot of effort.
But translating this to the 21st century highlights a massive cultural vulnerability, I think. We are constantly outsourcing the fashioning of our identity. We hand the carpenter's tools over to algorithms.
Oh, that's such a good point. We really do.
We allow the curated feeds of social media to bend our desires, to dictate our political outrage, and shape our insecurities. If you spend 3 hours a day scrolling through content algorithmically designed to harvest your attention through anger or envy, you are handing your raw material over to a machine that is carving you into a highly reactive, anxious consumer.
Taking the tools back requires a level of discernment that most people find really uncomfortable. Verses 81 and 82 define what a fashioned, wise mind actually looks like in practice. It says, as a solid rock is not shaken by the wind, wise people falter not amidst blame and praise. And then it adds that upon hearing the truth, they become serene, like a deep, smooth, and still lake.
Okay, wait, unshaken like a solid rock? I need to push back on this heavily.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because in modern psychology, if someone hurls blame and verbal abuse at you, and you just sit there completely unmoving like a stone wall, we call that emotional suppression or disassociation. We're taught today that health means feeling your feelings, being vulnerable, allowing things to impact you. If I am entirely unfazed by blame and totally indifferent to praise, am I truly wise, or am I just an emotional robot who has severed my connection to humanity?
That is a vital distinction to make because Stoic traditions and texts like this are constantly misinterpreted as advocating for emotional deadness. But look at how the text pairs the metaphors. It uses the rock alongside the deep lake. It isn't advocating for a lack of feeling, it is advocating for structural integrity.
How does the lake metaphor change the definition of the rock then?
Think about the physical dynamics of a deep lake. The surface of a lake is exposed to the atmosphere, it experiences the weather. When a storm blows in, the surface gets choppy, waves crash, the water is agitated. But if you dive 50 feet down into the depths of that same lake, the water is profoundly still. It's completely undisturbed by the chaos above.
So the surface still feels the weather.
Exactly. When someone hurls blame at you, the wise person still feels the surface ripple. Your amygdala still fires. You feel the sting of the insult, the flush of adrenaline, the frustration. But because you have fashioned your mind, you maintain a gap between that surface stimulus and your core identity.
Ah, I see.
The blame doesn't penetrate to the depths of the lake. It doesn't alter your fundamental self-worth. Verse 83 confirms this mechanism, actually. It says, "The wise walk on whatever befall, neither elated nor depressed by happiness or sorrow." They experience happiness and sorrow, but they don't let those passing weather systems dictate their existence.
So, practically speaking, if I launch a project at work and it completely fails, and my boss sends me a scathing email, the surface of my lake is going to get choppy. I acknowledge the disappointment. I might feel really embarrassed, but I don't let that email drop an anchor down into my core and convince me that I am fundamentally a failure. I keep the depth still.
Yes, and this is arguably even more important when dealing with praise.
Oh, right. If a post goes viral or you win a massive award, the surface gets incredibly excited. You get that huge dopamine rush. But if you let that praise reach your core, you attach your identity to external validation.
You become addicted to the applause.
Yes, and then you stop fashioning yourself according to your own values and start fashioning yourself into whatever crowd-pleasing shape will get you the next round of applause. You literally hand the carpenter's tools to your audience.
Well said. The wise person accepts the praise without letting it inflate their core, just as they accept the blame without letting it shatter their foundation.
So when you encounter blame or praise today, maybe a harsh critique from a client or a flurry of likes on a photo, visualize that deep lake. Notice the ripple on the surface. Feel the emotion, don't suppress it. But intentionally practice keeping the core of your identity still. Remind yourself, this is just weather. It's happening on the surface, but it has no power over the depths.
And once a person has successfully mastered this internal craftsmanship, once they can maintain that deep lake stillness amidst the violent weather of human interaction, what's the ultimate result? Where does this arduous journey actually lead? This brings us to Chapter 7, which describes the state of the Arhat, translated here as the Venerable.
This really feels like the transition from the active doing of wisdom to the effortless being of ultimate freedom.
Exactly. To understand this chapter, we have to briefly define what an arhat is in ancient Eastern philosophy. The word literally translates to one who is worthy or a perfected person. It describes someone who has achieved nirvana, which means they've blown out the flame of their desires, their ego, and their ignorance.
They're done fashioning.
Right. They have completed the process of fashioning themselves. Verse 90 says they have freed himself on all sides and thrown off all fetters. They're no longer bound by anxiety, by the opinions of society, or by that illusion of ownership we talked about back in Chapter 5.
Verse 94 has a great way of describing this internal mastery. It says they have subdued their senses like horses well broken in by a driver.
Notice the phrasing there again. The senses aren't killed or cut off, they are trained. A wild horse is dangerous and unpredictable, but a broken-in horse is incredibly powerful and useful.
Right.
The wild horses of our impulses, our craving for sugar, our urge to win every single argument, our addiction to novelty, are finally harnessed. The driver, which is your conscious awareness, is holding the reins with a steady hand.
And because the internal landscape is so controlled, their relationship to the external world completely changes. Verse 95 says this person is tolerant like the earth. No matter what humanity does to the earth, whether we dump toxic garbage on it, pave over it with concrete, or plant beautiful gardens in it, the earth accepts it all without complaint and remains exactly what it is.
It's fascinating how using nature to describe ultimate human liberation is a universal thread across world philosophy. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote about being the cliff against which the waves continually break. Early Taoist texts describe the ultimate sage as being like water yielding, seeking the lowest places, yet possessing the power to carve through rock. The author of the Dhammapada is tapping into this exact same insight. Ultimate strength isn't rigid dominance, it's profound, unbothered acceptance.
But this brings up a massive cultural clash when we look at how this liberation is described in verses 92 and 93. It says the path of this liberated person is difficult to understand, like that of birds in the air.
The trackless path.
Right. A bird flies through the sky and leaves absolutely no footprint, no trail, no wake. The moment the bird passes, the sky is exactly as it was. But modern society is entirely obsessed with leaving a footprint. We talk about minimizing our carbon footprint, sure, but maximizing our digital footprint. We are indoctrinated from childhood with the idea that we need to leave a legacy, make our mark on the world, build an empire so our name echoes through history.
We want to be remembered.
Desperately. We want to carve our initials into the tree of time. But this text is arguing that the absolute pinnacle of human development is to leave no trace whatsoever. It means gliding through life without dragging a massive, messy ego behind you.
It is entirely antithetical to our modern conditioning. We equate visibility with value. The underlying modern anxiety is, if you didn't document the vacation, did you really go? If you didn't leave a lasting legacy, did your life actually matter? The venerable person, according to this text, views legacy building as an exhausting, futile illusion.
It's just the fool from chapter 5 again.
Exactly. Seeking to leave a legacy is just the fool trying to exert ownership over a future they won't even exist in.
Trying to manage your PR campaign from beyond the grave.
Precisely. The bird in the air doesn't require the sky to validate that it flew. The joy, the meaning is in the flying itself. The venerable person does the right thing. They build the shelter, they feed the hungry, they live virtuously. Not to construct a monument to their own goodness, but simply because it is the correct way to interact with the present moment. Their thought is quiet, their word and deed are quiet, as verse 96 states. They don't need the applause of future generations.
This concept of leaving no trace ties into a verse that requires some careful modern translation, I think. Verse 95 says of the venerable person, no new births are in store for him. Historically, in the context of ancient India, this is referring to samsara, right? The continuous exhausting cycle of death and literal reincarnation driven by karma.
Yes. The ultimate goal was to escape this cycle.
But for a modern listener who doesn't necessarily hold a metaphysical belief in literal reincarnation, how do we unpack the wisdom of no new births?
Well, we can look at the psychological mechanics of what samsara represents. Whether you believe in literal rebirth or not, the truth of rebirthing our psychological patterns is undeniable. Think of it as breaking the cycle of recurring behavioral loops.
Give me an example of a behavioral rebirth.
How many times have you reborn the exact same toxic argument with your spouse, running the same script over and over again? How many times have we societally reborn the same generational traumas, passing our unhealed wounds down to our children? The venerable person has done the immense internal craftsmanship to ensure that their anger, their trauma, and their foolishness die with them.
They don't pass it on.
Exactly. They do not pass the poison forward. The cycle stops with them. That is how you experience no new births in this lifetime. You stop reincarnating your own misery.
The cycle stops with them. That is incredibly potent, and it connects perfectly back to the bird in the air. If you heal your trauma, you stop stomping around leaving destructive footprints on the psyches of the people around you. You stop leaving a wake of collateral damage.
Absolutely.
So look at your current ambitions this week. Where in your life are you stomping around trying to force a legacy? Where are you demanding recognition? Maybe subtly making sure everyone in the office knows you were the one who saved the account. Or making sure your partner knows exactly how much you sacrificed for them today. Identify that area and try just gliding quietly. Do excellent work, help someone out, but intentionally choose not to seek credit for it. See what it feels like to fly without leaving a track, even just for one afternoon.
It requires immense psychological security to fly without a track. And once you reach this serene state, it completely shatters how you perceive your resources, your energy, and most importantly, your time. You stop measuring your life in volume and start measuring it in depth.
Which leads us into the final chapter we're exploring today, Chapter 8, titled The Thousands. This chapter operates with a relentless, hammering rhythm. It repeatedly juxtaposes the power of the singular, qualitative moment against massive, staggering quantities.
It's a systemic dismantling of how humans typically measure success. Let's look at the text in verses 100 to 102. The author states that even if a speech is composed of 1,000 senseless words, one single word of sense that brings quiet is infinitely better. Even if a poem is 1,000 words long, one word of the law that brings peace is superior.
And verse 103 scales it up dramatically. It says, if one man conquer in battle 1,000 times 1,000 men, and if another conquer himself, he's the greatest of conquerors. Conquering an army of 1,000,000 men is deemed lesser than conquering the single internal territory of your own mind.
To understand how revolutionary this chapter really is, we have to look at the historical context of verses 106 to 108. The text mentions worshiping Agni in the forest for 100 years, or making oblations-like sacrifices for a whole year to gain merit.
Agni being the ancient Vedic fire god, right?
Yes. In the Brahminical orthodoxy of the time, maintaining the sacred fires and performing intricate, constant sacrifices of grain, ghee, and animals was the foundation of the spiritual economy. The religious status quo demanded endless, repetitive, external rituals to maintain cosmic order and build up your spiritual bank account.
A culture of accumulation.
Exactly. It was a culture of accumulation. You sacrifice thousands of offerings, you tend to fire for a century. The author of the Dhammapada walks into this deeply entrenched system and completely short-circuits it. They state that a single moment of paying homage to true inward knowledge, to someone who has fashioned their mind, is worth more than a century of external performative rituals. It was a massive disruption of the religious economy.
The audacity of telling people who have tended fires for decades that one quiet moment of internal clarity is worth more than all their accumulated effort. If we map that onto today, it's the ultimate indictment of our modern metric-driven lives. I mean, we don't tend sacred fires in the forest anymore, but we are absolutely obsessed with the metrics of the thousands.
We definitely worship the god of accumulation in different ways.
We really do. We consume thousands of senseless words a day on our feeds, endlessly scrolling, looking for a fleeting dopamine hit or a quick life hack, when sitting in silence for 5 minutes, finding one true, quiet word within ourselves would actually regulate our nervous systems. We measure the value of our lives in thousands. Thousands of steps on our Apple Watches, thousands of dollars in our investment portfolios, thousands of followers on our profiles. We operate under the delusion that if we just get more, it will eventually magically transform into better.
It's the fallacy of volume over quality. We assume a life of 100 years spent constantly hustling, grinding, and accumulating wealth is the ultimate victory condition. But the text launches a direct assault on that assumption in verses 110 through 115.
Those verses are breathtaking.
They really are. They declare that a person who lives 100 years vicious and unrestrained, or ignorant, or idle, it would be better to live just a single day virtuously, wisely, and fully awake to the reality of the universe. A single day of clarity outweighs a century of sleepwalking.
It's the ultimate antidote to modern FOMO, the fear of missing out. FOMO is a disease of quantity. It tells us we need 1,000 experiences to be fulfilled. We need to travel to 50 countries, attend every networking event, read every bestseller, watch every hit show. But the text argues we don't need more experiences. We need deeper engagement with the present one. It makes me think of going to a concert today.
Oh, how so?
Well, you look out at the crowd, and thousands of people are watching the artist through the screen of their iPhone, recording the entire show. They're capturing thousands of blurry, terrible-sounding digital files that they will never actually watch again. They are accumulating the event, but they are completely missing the physical, visceral reality of the music vibrating in the room. They are surviving the experience, but not living it.
That's a great analogy.
This text is begging us to put the phone down. Watching the artist perform one song with your own eyes, fully present, is worth more than 1,000 hours of recorded video on a hard drive.
That is exactly what the text means by living awake. If you're sleepwalking through your life, reacting blindly to your emotional impulses, constantly agonizing over your past regrets or calculating your future anxieties, it doesn't matter if modern medicine keeps your physical body alive to be 100 years old.
Yeah.
You missed the entire point. You were never actually here.
Right.
But if you can wake up, fashion your mind, and see the profound reality of the present moment clearly, a single day of that existence is infinitely more valuable than a century spent in the dark. The text is urging us to evaluate the texture of our consciousness, not the duration of our biological timeline.
So imagine that tomorrow is your one day to live fully awake, reflective, and completely present. If you only had those 24 hours to operate with this clarity, how would your priorities shift? What petty arguments would you instantly drop?
Yeah.
What superficial metrics would suddenly seem completely absurd? How much more closely would you look at the face of your child, or taste your food, or listen to the wind? Try to approach tomorrow as that one infinitely valuable day.
It immediately cuts through the noise of the thousands of trivial distractions we allow to consume us, doesn't it?
It really does. Let's pull all of this together. The psychological progression in this ancient text is stunningly clear. It begins by forcing us to wake up from the delusions of the fool, recognizing the crushing anxiety caused by our illusion of ownership, our performative behaviors, and the smoldering ashes of our unexamined habits.
And from there, we're challenged to stop outsourcing our identity. We have to pick up the tools and actively fashion our own minds like a carpenter shapes wood, cultivating the internal structure to maintain the stillness of a deep lake amidst the inevitable surface weather of blame and praise.
And as we master that craftsmanship, we reach toward the state of the venerable, learning to fly through our lives without leaving a messy trace, abandoning our desperate ego-driven need for a legacy, and putting an end to the cycle of rebirthing our traumas.
All of which culminates in the radical realization that a single day lived with this profound depth and trackless clarity is worth vastly more than a century of ignorant, exhausted accumulation.
Which leaves us with one haunting question to mull over. When you look at the trajectory of your life right now, are you measuring your success by the thousands of things you have accumulated, or by the quiet depth of a single awakened moment?
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.